It's always a bad day to be a Russian, but today seems to be an unusually bad week for senior Russian officials. They are dropping like flies, but who's really responsible? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's try to get to the bottom of it. Okay, so this is a really interesting story. So first off, let's talk about a Russian oligarch or oligarch adjacent guy who was found dead in Moscow after falling out of a window. This is, man, whoever's building these Russian buildings really needs to update their codes because, boy, only rich people seem to have these window-related accidents. Now, the guy's name is Mikhail Rogachev, and he's 64, and he's former vice president of the energy firm Yukos. And he died after falling from a window, according to Russian state media. So again, the fact that this guy, this story was picked up by Russian state media is sending a message. I think the medium is the message in this case, where the Russian state media says, this is officially something we take ownership of. Now, a law enforcement source said the body was found at the bottom of his building. They say the main cause of the Russian law enforcement says the right answer, that the main cause of death is, well, himself, and that he had a chronic medical illness. But, of course, another Telegram channel that claims to have links to Russian intelligence said that while he had health problems in recent years, it said, quote, they were not critical, and that he had been in touch with his family the previous night, and there were no hints about the possibility of him showing himself out, so to speak. I'm trying to find words to describe this that aren't going to get me demonetized, but it's not hard. Now, here's what things I think get interesting. The real question is, why, right? Because here's the thing. Putin has no problem assassinating people, right? The Kremlin has no problem offing people that they find to be problematic, but it's never done for no reason, right? It's always done with a purpose. And the thing is, once someone has been eliminated, right, you have cases like Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, who was killed 18 months ago. And in his case, right, you've got someone who posed an imminent threat. He led a large organization. He attempted to overthrow the Kremlin. His days were numbered. In contrast, you have lower-level executives like this who may not necessarily themselves control enough authority to get something done. And so there's a message hidden in there. So Rogachev, right, left Yukos. And when we look up Yukos, the thing is, Yukos was an energy firm that was owned by a Russian oligarch in the early 2000s that was basically forced to sell after that oligarch fled Russia and became an anti-Putin activist. And so they forced the sale of Yukos, right? So it had been something like 15 years since he had worked at Yukos. Instead, he had two other roles. One was executive director for innovation at a private investment fund called the Onzim Group. And he was also, and I think this is most important, deputy director general of mining and metallurgical work at Norilsk Nickel. And this is where I think he got himself into trouble, right? I think the Onzim Group is probably just a vehicle for him to enrich himself, right? But when we look up Norilsk Nickel, you can see that there is actually some interesting occurrences. Notably, that the head, Vladimir Potanin, said that Norilsk Nickel is going to start metallurgical smelting operations in China in the next 3 years due to difficulties in international payments. So Norilsk Nickel, the metals group controlled by Russia's richest man, Vladimir Potanin, likely someone who's so rich that Putin either doesn't want to go after him, or I think more likely, this is the man for whom the message is intended, right? Norilsk has announced, and this is an article from a few months ago in April, late April. And Potanin said in an interview with Russian state media that the mining corporation plans to replace copper smelting at Nadzhada in Russia with new facilities in China, right? Now, the Russian oligarch said it was one of the most detailed accounts of how Western sanctions are hampering the country's commodities exports. Potanin, of course, said that sanctions in Norlisk have cut into Norlisk revenues by about 15%, citing international payments, delivery refusals, pricing discounts, as well as troubles over plans to reduce sulfur dioxide pollution at copper plants. Right now, it says that Putin signed off on the plans, and the issue is included in the agenda for Russian-Chinese meetings. But I think there's more to it than this, right? And says a Chinese good is much harder to sanction in China than a Russian one supplied in China, is what Potanin said. Now, we know that Russia's been pulling out all the stops to make its international payments work, for lack of a better term. And the reality is that for a while, nickel production was, frankly, global nickel production depended on Norlisk nickel. You can see here that global exchange stocks of nickel plummeted off of during the Russian invasion. Right, you can see early in 2022 as Russia invaded. Right here, you can see nickel supply futures dropping to all-time lows, and they've been on the recovery. And this was about fears that Russian nickel production would be sanctioned and banned and not get to market. Now that those sanctions have those fears have kind of abated, the market has been recovering, right? So the fact that despite a recovering nickel market, Norlisk continued to lose money was a troubling sign, right? And it made you understand why Potanin made the decisions that he did. But here's the problem. The Russian central bank needs international payments to continue, right? Because Russia, the state, cannot get a cut of Chinese-made copper sold in China, right? At no point do rubles enter that transaction. And if you're the central bank, you need to have external demand for rubles, right? Or demand for rubles by anybody in order to exchange them for other currencies to keep the ruble stable. And so part of this inflation fight is making sure that despite the difficulties, international payments still take place. And Russia's been working on all kinds of schemes. They're literally making their own shitcoin cryptocurrency. They're trying to do it in truckloads of gold bar, right? Imagine if instead of swiping your card to buy a PC, for example, you had to give them an entire 1 kilogram brick of gold, right? That's the kind of absurdity that Russia's defaulting to. But that's what they're stuck in thanks to these sanctions. So what happens? Well, Putin wants to let Potanin know, to say, hey, listen, I know you want to move these factories over to China. You'll make more money. You think you'll make more, right? Your company will make more. And you are Russian-based. But you cannot, despite all of these sanctions and difficulties, or in fact, because these sanctions are making life so difficult, it is imperative that major Russian export industries stay inside Russia, no matter what. And so while Putin may have, or the Kremlin may have signed off on this plan, the reality is Putin appears to have changed his mind. And he wants to send a message to Potanin that says, these games are not to be played. And of course, he can't kill Potanin himself, a major Russian oligarch who's likely too protected, or killing him wouldn't achieve the objectives. And so he says, listen, I'm going to go after the guy who's responsible for metallurgical work in Norilsk nickel. And, well, frankly, that is, of course, Rogachev. So now Rogachev literally has been killed just to send a message. And that message is, stay inside Russia. But that's not the only assassinations we've seen so far. Military officers have had an equally bad time. But of course, if you feel like you are just cannot get it done, if you feel like Putin trying to keep Russian companies staying in your heavily sanctioned country, right, you may not need to throw your enemies out the window. You may just need a little more caffeine. That's why I created Strike Gum, inspired by my time in Afghanistan, when if I needed energy, I had to crack open a lukewarm energy drink that I took on patrol. And once you've had a disgusting energy drink that tastes like cough medicine deep in the Afghan heat of the desert, you really think about alternatives. That's why Strike Gum is better than an energy drink in every way. This has 0 sugar, but all the caffeine of a Red Bull or an Amp Energy, plus 100 milligrams of alpha GPC. It's a no-brainer. Go to strikegum.com, pick some up. We're the highest rated energy gum on Amazon. Thanks to all you guys that have left us 5-star reviews over there. That makes a huge difference. And of course, if you want it, you can go to Amazon, just search for Strike Gum and pick some up. So the link is in the description, though, if you want to get it on strikegum.com, where we've got all the discounts. So let's talk about the sad fate of some other Russian officers. Now, this is a little different because these two deaths are reported not by Russian state media, but actually by the Ukrainian intelligence services. So one is a high-ranking Russian pilot, a commander of Russian aviation, who was found dead in Bryansk Oblast. This is according to Ukrainian military intelligence. And again, the fact that Ukrainian military intelligence knew this guy died before anybody else, and that the Russians wanted to pretend it never happened, is itself kind of telling. The individual suffered multiple head injuries, possibly caused by a hammer, and the Ukrainian intelligence agency actually published photos. Obviously, I can't show them on YouTube, showing his body in an apple orchard. But they said, we don't know who did this. We just happened to have a cameraman on station. So again, this is someone who served as chief of staff of a Russian aviation squadron, particularly a heavy bomber regiment, whose aircraft carry out missile attacks against Ukraine. You also had a high-ranking GRU, this is Russian military intelligence officer, who was shot dead in Moscow. Again, this is something that was reported by the Moscow Times and a Russian Telegram channel. But according to Russian state media and TASS, Klenkov returned home a week ago from Ukraine's front line. And Russian state media said the reports into the shooting was ongoing. So again, that makes me think that possibly this is someone who may have actually been run afoul of Moscow, which is interesting, right? Now, maybe this is someone who is responsible, for example, for keeping under wraps the North Korean delegation contingent that had been sent to Ukraine. Obviously, that's caused an international controversy, and there's been a lot of leaked footage of inside operations to the North Korean deployment. And so I wonder if maybe he's deemed responsible for this, or it could be something as simple as the Ukrainian HRU conducting this assassination. But again, they usually claim credit for a job well done. And as discussed, the Ukrainians killed this pilot with a hammer, and this dude was shot by an armed assailant, a firearm, in Moscow. So it makes me think that, and it was reported by TASS instead of covered up, Russian state media. So that makes me think that actually this guy ran afoul of someone inside the Kremlin. Again, usually, if you're a dictator, it's a sign. It's what's known as a clue. When you have to rely more and more on force and coercion and threats to ensure compliance, right? As you tilt in that direction, what you end up with is that is what happens when your regime is falling apart, right? You have to tighten your grip by force, right? When your regime is going well, you can rely on rewards, right? It's like carrots and sticks. The carrots are more effective when the regime is already stable. Everybody loves getting rich, but when the regime is unstable and no one's getting rich and more people are discontented and you have to rely on more and more extreme measures, it can be a sign that your regime is not as stable as you might think. Anyway, that's all I had, guys. Thank you so much to Martin Rom, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all of our Lieutenant Team members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.